No idea what setup to start with or how to adjust any setup to your driving level and style in Assetto Corsa Competizione? Well, look no further, as today I'm gonna show you how to go from being overwhelmed by all of this to a great baseline setup and just having to adjust this. This process will make it way easier to get a setup that actually fits your skill level and driving style, so you don't have to rely on other people's setups. Welcome back to HD Racing. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a pro driver or tuner. But these steps are based on what pro drivers do with their setups, and I've had great success with them as a somewhat intermediate level driver. I personally struggle a lot with the aggressive preset for some cars. But with an easy to set up baseline, it doesn't take long for me to get a setup that I can drive quite well. This all works in version 1.9.8. If future versions change anything, I'll update you in the pinned comment. But let's get going. To start with, we are going to have to make quite a few changes to get to that baseline that I was talking about. Once you're there though, the process of adjusting the setup further is a lot easier. I would recommend getting started with a safe preset if you're very new to ACC or racing in general. Otherwise, start with the aggressive preset. In both cases, follow along with the adjustments I'm gonna show you. I'm not gonna explain a lot why we are making certain changes, as that would make this video very long and convoluted. Some changes may seem very counterintuitive and unrealistic, but these settings work very well in the current version of ACC. And that goes not only for the GT3s, but also GT4s and GT2s. The latter two just may have less settings to adjust in some cases. So let's now head in game so you can follow along. I'll go with the aggressive preset for this demonstration. So let's do some changes, shall we? First of all, we are not gonna talk about tire pressures or brake ducts in this video. A, because they are very much dependent on the track and the conditions, but also I've already done a video showcasing how you set these correctly, which I will link for you if you need a refresher. But we are gonna start with toe. Start setting this to negative 0.15 in the front and positive 0.05 in the rear. This will be a very good starting point that we can adjust later if necessary. For camber, set this to the most negative value you can, both in the front and in the rear. This is almost always the best option in ACC's current patch. For caster, set this to the maximum value. This will give you a better turn-in response and also improved force feedback feel, so it's a very good option to set this to the maximum in most cars. You may have to reduce it in some by a couple of clicks if the turn-in is a little bit too harsh, but as I said, in most cars this is the best option for ACC's current patch. Next, we will head to the electronics page. Here you can almost always leave TC, ABS and ECU map as it is set for your preset, but if you have TC2 available to you, reduce that to 0 as it almost always hinders you more than it helps. We are gonna talk about TC and ABS a little bit more later on. But let's now head to fuel and strategy. Here, just set the fuel load that you want to use for whatever you're doing, and as I said in the previous video, if you're doing a short race under 90 minutes, go for brakes 1. And then we come to the most complicated section, mechanical grip. But we are gonna make our life a lot easier here. Start by setting the front anti-roll bar to the maximum value and the rear anti-roll bar to the minimum value. Brake power, just leave it 100%, and brake bias set to about 25% of the slider, because percentages are gonna differ from car to car. So for me, I'm just gonna set it somewhere here. Steering ratio you can almost always leave as is, and we're gonna talk a little bit more what that does and if you want to adjust that later on. Now we come to the springs. Because it works so well and it makes our life so much easier, we are just gonna make the car very soft. And that means dropping both the wheel rate and the bump stop rate to the minimum value, both on the front and on the rear. For bump stop range, we are gonna set it to round about the middle of the slider for now. We're gonna talk a little bit more about it later, but just get it roughly to the middle right now. And this is how I'm gonna set it for now. And the last thing to do is the preload differential here at the bottom. We are also just gonna drop that to the minimum value. And that is the mechanical grip section done for now. Let's now head to the dampers. And those are also very complicated normally, but we are gonna make our life a lot easier here as well. And it may seem very weird, but we are just gonna reduce the bump, both normal and fast, to the most negative value, both in the front and in the rear, and the rebound to the maximum value, both fast and normal, and both front and rear. As I said, may look weird, but it works very well in ACC right now, and setting dampeners correctly normally takes a lot of effort in terms of going through telemetry like Motec, for example, and we really don't want to get into that right now. So that's the dampers done. Very easy, right? Let's head into the aero section. Here we are not gonna talk about brake ducts, as I already said. I've explained how these work and how you set them correctly in the previous video. What we are gonna do is reduce the front splitter to the minimum and the rear wing to the maximum value. Right height we can leave as is for now, and it might be a little bit higher in the front for you if you've picked the safe preset, but that's not a big deal for now. And that's already it. This is our baseline setup. We can now work with this to make it fit our driving style and our skill level, and also make it behave the way we want. To do that, we will however first need to adjust brake ducts and tire pressures. So get on track and do that as I've explained in the previous video. Once you have the correct pressures and temperatures, you will then again need to head out on track and do a few laps to figure out how the car behaves and what you actually want and need to change from the baseline setup. By the way, in the background you're seeing me driving the Mercedes AMG GT3 right now, a car that I haven't driven all that much. And this is with the aggressive preset, so without any of the changes that we just outlined. And that is just to show you how much I was struggling with that and how much the adjustments that we just made for the baseline setup helped, as we're gonna take a look at a lap afterwards with the baseline setup, so where I went through the exact same process that we just did for the McLaren. And you'll be able to see how much easier it will be for me to handle the car with the baseline setup, and also how much faster I can go with it. While that's running in the background, let's talk about what we want to look out for when driving the baseline setup with the adjusted tire pressures and brake ducts, to figure out what we actually still want to change on it to make it fit our driving style and just behave the way that we want to. You want to take note of where your car over or understeers too much and in which situations that exactly occurs. And that could be on turn-in, on brakes, on corner entry, exit, on throttle, just mid-corner in general. So you could maybe have some understeer problems while on the brakes and going into the corner, and maybe some oversteer while going on throttle if you exit a corner. Something like that. Just take note of the situations where your car behaves not the way that you want to, be it understeering and not really being able to turn, or oversteering and the rear snapping on you, or the car just generally becoming too unstable in certain situations. And if you've done that, we can go back to the setup screen and then talk about what we can actually do if you experience under or oversteer in certain situations. This time we will start in the aero section. Here we can play with both the front and the rear ride height. And that will affect how the car in general feels, so if it's in general more over or more understeery. The difference between the front and the rear is what is actually affecting that the most, and that's called rake. More difference between the two means more rake and means that the car will overall be more oversteery. Lowering the difference between the two, so for example lowering the rear ride height or increasing the front, will mean less rake and the car being more understeery. If you started on the aggressive preset, your front ride height will probably already be quite low. On the safe preset, however, it is most likely a little bit higher. If you want to affect your car to be less understeery and more oversteery, then lowering the front is probably your best option. That will also increase the aerodynamics because the car is just lower to the ground. If you still need a little bit more rotation on the car in general, increase the rear ride height a bit, and if you want less rotation, decrease it. It makes the car a little bit more understeery, but safer. For more specific problems, we will now head to the mechanical grip section. Here we can take a look at brake bias first. If you notice that your car is not behaving well while braking, be it too understeery or oversteery, this is a great setting to adjust. If you need more rotation, so less understeer while braking, you can lower this value more. And if you feel like it's rotating too much and snapping on you while on braking, then you can increase it. But generally, lower values will make you faster in the long run. Somewhat adjacent to that and tackling a similar problem are the front bump stop ranges. Reducing these to the lowest value would mean that the front suspension can move almost not at all while going on brakes or turning into a corner, which would lead to more understeer in those situations. On the other hand, if you increase this to the maximum value, that means that the front suspension can move quite a lot more, and that would mean more traction on the front, which is good, but that could increase oversteer again because the balance between front and rear is shifted, and maybe the rear then doesn't have enough traction anymore. So this is a value that you will need to play with, but generally think of the front bump stop ranges as with lower values meaning more understeer and higher values meaning more traction, but potentially more oversteer. I generally set these somewhere between the halfway and the 3/4 mark. So play with these if you have problems going on the brakes or turning into a corner. The rear bump stop ranges work pretty much the same, but they have a very different effect here. If you lower these to the lowest value, that once again means that the suspension in the rear this time can't really travel all that much, but that means that if you put weight on it, so if you accelerate, that the rear really has nowhere to go and it can start sliding, and that would increase oversteer. While on the other hand, if you increase this value to the maximum, the rear suspension has quite a lot of travel, and that means if you put the power down, that the rear can then move quite a bit, and that would reduce oversteer and increase understeer. So in general, I would say once again, put this somewhere between the halfway and the 3/4 mark, and you're pretty much good to go. But just remember that contrary to the front, increasing this value will increase understeer, while lowering it will increase oversteer, and that effect is strongest while pushing down the throttle. Let's now quickly talk about electronics, because the first setting here, traction control, actually does something kind of similar to what we did with the rear bump stop ranges, just in a very different way. Because TC is an electronic system that interferes with the actual spinning of your tires if it detects that you have wheel spin or that you may be spinning out because the left and the right side of your wheels are not in sync enough anymore. And it will do that more if the value is higher, and that will mean that yes, it is safer to run higher values because, well, it interferes more and prevents you from spinning out while pushing down the throttle, but it will also make you slower. While on the other hand, if you reduce this value, it will not have interfere as much or not at all if TC is off, but that would mean it's way more dangerous to put down the throttle, and if you're not careful, you can spin out easily. So be careful with this value, stay away from TC off if you're a beginner, and play with something between like 1 and 4 maybe, and you can definitely take the values that are in the safe or in the aggressive preset. One notable exception where you would run way higher values is the Ferrari 296, which actually can run something between like 6 and 8 easily, because the TC on that car is very good. But normally for almost all other cars, something between 1 and 4. Play with this, and if you notice that the system is interfering too much, reduce it, and if it's not interfering enough and you're spinning out, increase this. Next up is the ABS, or your anti-lock braking system. And that, as the name suggests, will prevent your wheels from locking up if you push the brake too hard, which is something these cars have, and you should make use of that. But too high values would mean that the ABS is interfering too much and you will lose braking power because of that. And too low values, or even setting this to off, would mean that you run the risk of actually having lockups in the wheels, which will make your car just slide and not brake at all. So generally a value between like 1 and 3 is run on most cars. Sometimes you can run a little bit higher. Again, with the Ferrari 296, it's a very notable exception where you would run higher values. But in general, just try to run as low of a value as possible so you have the maximum braking power while still not having lockup in the wheels because the ABS isn't interacting enough. Last but not least, let's take a look at the tire section once again. As I said in the beginning, we can play with the toe a little bit more. And if we do that in the front, by reducing it, we would improve our corner entry a little bit more by making the car rotate more, but that would come at the cost of maybe having a little bit more oversteer on corner entry. If that's the case and you still have that, you can of course also increase this value to have the car a little bit more stable on corner entry. But in general, you want this value in the front to be negative, and I've seen anything from like -0.1 to all the way negative, but that's a little bit extreme for me, so I usually stay between like -0.25 to -0.1. So play with that if you want to really fine-tune your corner entry. The rear toe is an excellent adjustment for general stability, because increasing this value will also increase the stability of your car most of the time, but it can come at a cost of induced understeer. On the other hand, if you want your car to be a little bit more pointy, but maybe have a little bit more oversteer, then decreasing this value is a good idea. But I would generally stay away from negative values in the rear and stay between like 0 and maybe 0.15. And that's all the adjustments that I would make to the baseline setup. With these, you should be able to set the car to your personal skill level and liking for your driving style, and not have to worry about all the interplay between all the different settings that there are. Because as you have seen, we've set a lot of those to just standard values and are adjusting only a few for very specific problems and purposes. Let me now quickly show you my personal McLaren setup for Barcelona that I also use as a baseline for every other track. You can see that in the tires page I really didn't change anything from the baseline. On the electronics I just reduced ABS a bit to have a little bit interference, but left traction control at 3, though sometimes I reduce it to 2 as well if I feel like it. In the mechanical grip section, also pretty much baseline, and I played with the bump stop ranges in the front and the back to have a little bit better feeling for braking and accelerating, and also reduced brake bias a little bit as well. I also reduced the steering ratio by 1, which I haven't talked about yet, but that just basically means that I have to turn my steering wheel less for the same amount of turning of the actual wheels. So lower values means you have to turn the wheel less, and higher values mean that you have to turn your wheel more. That is most of the time just personal preference. I, at least in the McLaren, prefer the value to be a little bit lower. So play with this if you are feeling like it's a little bit sluggish or a little bit too snappy. And in the aero section, I just increased the rear ride height a little bit from the baseline to have a little bit more rotation, but not too much, because I didn't want a very oversteery car in general. And that's already it. I hope my method of setting a baseline setup and then adjusting to what you feel the car needs helps you out. If it does, I would really appreciate it if you left a like on the video and considered subscribing to the channel for more racing content both on ACC and other games. If you have any questions or problems with this, let us know in the comments down below, and I or others can hopefully help you out. If you're interested in some more interesting racing content, feel free to click the video on screen right now. But with that, I hope you enjoyed. I've been HD Racing. Thanks a lot for watching.